Nearly 500 years after his death, Niccolo Machiavelli still looms large over debates about leadership. Thanks to the invidious reputation of his best-known work, The Prince, he's come to be associated with an uncompromising pragmatism, cunning, and ruthlessness, and his name is rarely invoked without a sense of praise or blame. We habitually brand political leaders Machiavellian as a manner of stressing their skill or illustrating their flaws, and every year another slew of books appears dedicated to showing how leaders can become more, or perhaps more rarely, less Machiavellian. Yet precisely because Machiavelli's reputation is so baleful, because his name is applied so widely, it has come to obscure what he actually said about leadership, and more importantly, what he didn't. Today, I'd like to offer a very brief corrective to this. I'm going to address 4 questions. Why did leadership matter to Machiavelli? What did a good leader look like? How radical was Machiavelli? And what lessons can Machiavelli teach leaders today? So, why did leadership matter to Machiavelli? Machiavelli's Italy was a turbulent place. In the Storie Fiorentine, he wrote of it as questo guasto mondo, this ruined world, a place of upheaval and suffering ruled over by fortune, the goddess of chance. Unlike many contemporary humanists who imagined fortune as a blindfolded figure turning a wheel, Machiavelli often pictured her like this: a beautiful, capricious woman, as changeable as the wind and as kind or as cruel as the waves. It was an opposite image. In the late 15th century, Italy was a patchwork quilt of states. There was the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, Duchy of Milan, a handful of little lordships, and a few republics like Florence. Each had its own unique constitution, but they all shared some of the same structures and all grappled with the same vulnerabilities. When, in 1494, Charles VIII... Well, we'll just have to imagine Charles VIII, I'm afraid. Charles VIII of France marched into Italy. The peninsula was plunged into a series of wars that would last on and off for the next 60 years. States changed hands with alarming speed and regularity. Regimes came and went, and uncertainty reigned. In one city, there were no fewer than 30 changes of regime. And Machiavelli suffered too. After about 14 years as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, he was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured when the Machiavelli returned to take back control of the city. As Machiavelli recognised, the question of what made a good leader was hence of vital importance to political leaders themselves. Whether they were princes with formal titles, elected heads of republican governments, or unofficial rulers of the city, they all needed to know how power, once acquired, could be retained. But it also had a wider significance too. As Machiavelli explained in the Discorsi, the liberty of a republic, like Florence, depended on its citizens. They could only live free from foreign domination and domestic tyranny if they were committed to their freedom. But because people are fickle and often choose self-interest over the common good, Machiavelli believed they needed good leaders to keep them on the right track. So, what did a good leader look like? Machiavelli was not the first person to tackle this problem. As far back as classical antiquity, learned men had been advising princes about the qualities they needed, and these ad hoc works had later evolved into a complete literary form, the so-called Mirror of Princes. This had acquired fresh significance during the Renaissance. From the 14th century onwards, humanists had churned out a growing number of treatises, and like earlier writers, they had believed that the key to political survival was virtue. Naturally, they glossed this in different ways, but they generally agreed that it was just an exaggerated form of those moral qualities to which all Christians should aspire, namely justice, fortitude, faith, hope, and so on. Machiavelli thought this was all hogwash, though. In The Prince, which he wrote shortly after being released from prison in 1513, he explained that in seeking to describe the characteristics of an ideal prince, contemporary humanists had confined themselves to a world of theoretical fancy, far removed from the often harsh realities of politics. As such, any ruler who attempted to follow their advice too rigidly would find himself unprepared to deal with the world that actually existed. What a prince needed, Machiavelli believed, was to learn how not to be good. To explain what he meant by this, he returned to the rather misogynistic image of Fortune as a woman. If a prince was too inflexible or too weak to stand up to her, he said, he'd be pushed around. Only a man who could adapt himself to her wiles and who, if necessary, was prepared to beat and coerce her would receive her favour. What a prince required, therefore, was not virtue in the traditional sense, but virtù, the quality of being a vir, a man. He needed to be bold and daring. He needed to rise above the base pursuit of riches, and above all, he needed to govern in such a way that it would bring him honour and glory. To do this, Machiavelli argued, a prince needed three things. First, he needed a means of defending himself against a foreign enemy. At the time, most states relied on mercenaries, but bitter experience had taught Machiavelli how dangerous this was. Not only were mercenaries expensive, he argued, but they were also disunited, ambitious, undisciplined, and disloyal. Far better, Machiavelli believed, to rely on a citizen militia. Those citizens were not as well trained and often much more difficult to organise. They at least had a vested interest in defending their homeland. The second thing that a prince needed was an understanding of how to conduct himself so as to avoid provoking internal subversion from his subjects. The key, of course, was to avoid being hated too much. And to do this, a prince needed to do away with all the things that princes were usually expected to do. The first quality that was expected of them was generosity. If a prince wanted to buy support with his largesse, Machiavelli argued, he had to be pretty lavish. But if he did this, he'd quickly run out of his own money and would have to raise taxes, which would obviously make his subjects hate him. If he was parsimonious, by contrast, living on his own means, he would show true generosity to his subjects and thereby win their affection. It was the same with compassion. Although princes always liked to be compassionate, they should not use mercy indiscriminately. If a prince's opponents think they can rebel without facing any consequences, it would be impossible to keep order. Far better to be cruel. For while love is fickle, fear is sure. This came with a caveat, though. A prince needed to take care that he was not so cruel that he was hated, because in time the citizens' hatred would eventually outweigh their fear with predictable results. Honesty didn't need to trouble the prince much either. Of course, it'd be nice if he was honest, but since few men were, it would be madness for the prince to keep his word on principle. Like the fox, he needs to know how to sniff out danger and how to avoid it without compromising himself. As such, he must never honour his word when doing so puts him at a disadvantage. In short, he must know how to be a great liar and dissimulator. It was also important to know how to trust. Too often princes were surrounded by flatterers whose advice was designed to serve not his interest but their own. He should instead take care to surround himself with only wise, experienced advisers. The third and final thing that a prince needed was a broad-based government. Given that Renaissance states were generally racked by tensions between the grassi, literally the fat cats, and the popolo, the people, it was important to know how to handle their rivalry. As Machiavelli knew, princes were generally inclined to rely most heavily on the grassi, since their interests usually aligned with his own. But the grassi were avid only for their own gain. If the prince relied too much on them, some would eventually become disgruntled and rise against him, thinking of taking the whole cake for themselves. Far better for the prince to use the popolo as a counterweight. Not only were they more numerous, but they also had an interest in keeping the wealthy in check. Provided the prince didn't rely on them too much, and provided they were restrained by a muscular state religion and stern laws, there was every reason, Machiavelli believed, to give them an equal, if not more prominent role in government. There were plenty of examples of leaders who reflected elements of this. Machiavelli praises Hannibal for his harshness, Julius II, the warrior pope, for his daring, hard to believe but true, and Cesare Borgia for ruthlessly executing his rebellious captains. But how radical was this really? Well, less than's usually thought. Granted, in conception and approach, the prince was certainly novel. Machiavelli's abandonment of moral idealism for realism did mark a break with the past, but the more closely we look at Machiavelli's arguments, the less radical he seems. Machiavelli was not trying to show how a prince could do whatever he wanted, nor did he believe that a prince should always be dishonest, cruel, and parsimonious. Despite what he sometimes claimed, he was neither the spokesman for tyrants nor the prophet of amorality. He repeatedly stressed that prudence, justice, etc. did have some value, and that if a prince could exercise them, then all well and good. He even praised Cosimo de' Medici for embodying these ideals. He was simply trying to illustrate that if a prince wanted to survive, his actions shouldn't be constrained. And in any case, their inverse was not nearly as bad as sometimes made out. Machiavelli's goals were modest too. Throughout his career, he was preoccupied not with furthering the ambitions of an individual, but with maintaining the state in liberty and under its present government against the threats from within and without. Hardly a really radical aim. Finally, many of his ideas were already familiar. His dictum that it's better to be feared than loved was probably riffing off Seneca's critique of the adage that they should let them hate as long as they fear. So too, his preference for cruelty over compassion can be traced back to opinions expressed by France's generals. And back in 1499, the state of Florence had executed a general, Paolo Vitelli, without any evidence at all, just pour encourager les autres. So, what can leaders learn from Machiavelli today? Again, not what we usually think. Though his writings have a striking immediacy, we need to distinguish between relevance and resonance. Each of Machiavelli's works was written with a specific audience in mind to address a specific purpose in a specific context. The Prince, dedicated to Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, was intended to show how a prince who had won his state with the arms of others and the help of fortune could stay in power. The Discorsi was addressed to a group of rebellious youths in an attempt to show them how not to misuse ancient literature, and so on and so forth. None of these works was intended to serve posterity over the present, and none of those circumstances were repeated today. Though they might have some resonances, it's misguided to see them as having direct application to our own situation, much less apply them to fields like business or management. So too, we need to remember that Machiavelli didn't set out to provide a blueprint for leadership. His comments on mercenaries and classes apart, he was too pragmatic, too attuned to the wilds of fortune to propose a set of unyielding rules valid in all circumstances at all times. Rather, he just wanted to show the sort of things that a leader should be ready to do if the circumstances required. He didn't offer an educational program to make leaders and left open the question of whether good leaders are born or made. So even if there are contemporary resonances, we should be wary of looking for a model in Machiavelli's writings. But what Machiavelli does provide us with is a framework for analysing leadership, for interrogating political leaders, their decisions and approach. Did, for example, Carlos Puigdemont fail to achieve Catalonian independence because of a simple lack of daring? Was the same true of Juan Guaido in Venezuela? Was Liz Truss's choice of advisers her undoing? More controversially, was Boris Johnson's real fault not being dishonest enough? Shh. How misguided is Putin's reliance on mercenaries? And how much does he benefit from his connections with the Orthodox Church? Now, Machiavelli offers no answers to these. But if we follow his method and let ourselves be led by a clear-eyed assessment, free from assumptions about right and wrong, we may find ourselves arriving at an understanding of what is both appropriate and necessary. So, if I can leave you with a final thought, let it be this. Machiavelli was certainly less Machiavellian than he's usually made out. His relevance for leaders of today is less than his resonance, and the direct lessons he can teach us are few. Yet, if his writings, read without the burden of preconceptions, can be used to interrogate rather than to prescribe, they can still help us to grapple with the problem of leadership in this most uncertain and most Machiavellian of worlds. Thank you.
But when did his book, Il Principe, become this blueprint for ruthless leadership and sly statecraft?
Pretty quickly is the answer. Not in the sense of it being taken as a blueprint, but regarded as something wicked. Within a few decades of his death, contemporary, not near contemporaries, the next generation, people like Cardinal Pole were describing the Prince as having been written by Satan's hand. And that was simply because of Machiavelli's break with the traditional view that virtue and morality should be the guide of a prince's actions. It wasn't necessarily because it was a book about tyranny or whatever, it was just because it was unusual in approach. And later on, it becomes his attitudes towards the use and abuse of religion become used, and morality become used paradoxically by both sides in the great wars of religion. Protestants and Catholics alternately start accusing one another of being Machiavellian and also occasionally claiming Machiavelli for themselves. So it's a very confused picture, but these conflicting interpretations, including that of Machiavelli as the wicked monster, appear pretty quickly.
You said his concept, virtù, is something different from our concept of virtue. He also has the idea of fortuna as something important. How should we interpret this? Is that just what we mean with fortune?
No, well, as I said at the beginning, Fortune, the allegorical goddess of chance, is traditionally viewed up until Machiavelli's day as a blind woman who is turning a wheel on which sit several figures. When the figure is at the top, they are traditionally shown as like the king, I am the king. Then as the wheel turns, I was king, I am just at the bottom, and I will be king again, and it turns around. The idea being that we can't control this cycle of fate that we inevitably are exposed to. However, by the time Machiavelli is reaching maturity, a change is occurring in Italian and particularly Florentine thinking, and there's been some very, very, very good recent work done on this by Nicholas Baker. I thoroughly recommend his book. And it moves towards viewing Fortune as this capricious woman. As I described, someone who has absolutely no regard for people's goodness or badness, but who will do just whatever she likes and seems to derive some pleasure from making lives unpleasant. Now, Machiavelli may have found this a particularly apposite image because he was a pretty rotten husband and was always messing around and rightly getting told off.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much.
That's great.